The British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is in the hospital right now being observed for a disease that is COVID-19. We go now to David Merritt, our colleague over in London, for an update. We've had some news today, as I understand it, David, about the Prime Minister's condition.
Yes, that's right. We were just hearing from his deputy, Dominic Raab. The Foreign Secretary's just been speaking a couple of moments ago, who said there's been no significant change, at least no deterioration in the Prime Minister's condition. He remains, though, in the intensive care unit in the hospital in London. So his situation can be described as serious, but he's been put on oxygen to help his breathing, but no mechanical aid to his breathing. So he's not on a ventilator, which is obviously the most serious stage, as we now know, of this disease. Now, having said all of that, it was at the same press conference yesterday where we were assured that there was no serious change in the Prime Minister's condition. 3 hours later, we were told, in fact, things had got worse and he was in intensive care. So, of course, as we know, this disease can develop and deteriorate rapidly. But so far, he seems to be stable and says that there is no change. And they pledged that as soon as there was a change, there would be an announcement.
And I know we all wish him only the very best and a speedy recovery. In the meantime, who's running the country, to put it very bluntly?
Well, the short answer is his deputy, Mr. Raab, who stood up just to make this press conference. He's the Foreign Secretary. You may recall he used to be the Brexit Secretary briefly under Theresa May before he resigned that position. He ran for the Tory leadership against Mr. Johnson, got down to the last 6 or so, eventually losing out to him. And is now, as I said, the Foreign Secretary. So he says that he is the person who is deputising for Mr. Johnson. The phrase he used was "where necessary," and he was at pains in the press conference just now to say that the cabinet as a whole are making collective decisions where necessary. So there's no one who has become the Prime Minister. That remains Mr. Johnson. But the way the UK is set up government-wise is a bit different to the US. If the president is indisposed, there's someone ready to step up. It's not quite the same here. No one new is called the Prime Minister until the Queen appoints him. So it's a little bit convoluted, a little bit murky, and the timing, frankly, could not be worse. We have the virus hitting its peak right now for at least the next week or possibly 2 weeks. The government having to review its lockdown measures in a week's time. Mr. Johnson clearly isn't going to be back at work by then. So Mr. Raab having to make those decisions, a lot of pressure on the cabinet, and can they all maintain their discipline without Mr. Johnson around the table? That is a big question at the moment.
Also, David, I assume that in the United Kingdom, as it is in here and in so many other countries around the world right now, most of the decisions of government have to do with how you respond to this virus. As a practical matter, are there major policy decisions to be made there, or do they basically have their approach laid out and it's a matter of executing it, as it were?
Well, it's a good question, and I think at this press conference just now, we saw Dominic Raab flanked by the two chief scientific advisors, who he says, and Mr. Johnson always said, all the decisions are based on the advice they've been getting. Patrick Vallance, the chief scientific officer, Professor Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer. But, of course, the conditions are changing. You know, we saw a couple of weeks ago the government change its strategy and suddenly impose this lockdown from having a rather more laissez-faire attitude. Back then, that was 2 weeks ago, they said they were going to review the situation in 3 weeks' time. That's next Monday. So there's a big decision to be made next week. Do they continue with the restrictions on business, on the economy as it is now? Do they start to relax it like some countries in Europe? Last night, Austria, Denmark gave a roadmap to how they might start opening their economy. So these are big, impactful decisions. There's also a lot of work being done on how to support companies, small businesses, employees. That is moving rapidly as well. Huge amounts of money being spent to try to keep the economy alive. And all of these decisions have to be made on a daily basis. So, yes, there are big decisions coming up, and Mr. Johnson is not going to be able to make any of them. So, as I said, the cabinet as a whole having to come together, but we've had a lot of reports in recent days about infighting without Mr. Johnson around. So can they make those decisions sensibly and rely on Mr. Raab to steer them through this most difficult time?
And I wonder, David, whether there might be another set of decisions having to do with allocation of precious equipment, things like that personal protective equipment we've learned so much about, things like ventilators. How is the National Health Service holding up? Certainly we have that crisis here in the United States, how we allocate that very scarce and critical equipment.
Yeah, well, it sort of depends who you listen to on this question. You know, a pretty devastating survey from the British Medical Association this afternoon was published, which said that a majority of doctors say they don't feel safe in their workplace, so they're not having enough of this protective equipment sent to them. When you hear the chief medical officer, they talk about how there is plenty in the system and it's being sent. And there's been a few problems with distribution. On the ventilator question as well, similarly to the United States, companies have been stepping up to manufacture more ventilators because they definitely need a lot more than they currently have, and some of those are starting to trickle in. But again, lots of complaints from some hospitals saying they still haven't arrived. They're worried about capacity. One thing is true, though, that so far the National Health Service seems to be holding up. We have not reached capacity. They built a 4,000-bed hospital in London, in a convention centre in East London called the Nightingale Hospital. That has not yet been needed. So far, and this question was put to the Chief Scientific Officer just a few moments ago, he said so far it is holding up. He cannot pledge that it will be the same situation for months to come, but we haven't seen the sort of overwhelming of the health service that we've seen in the past weeks in places like Spain and Italy.